There is a quiet lie repeated so often it has become invisible, that higher states of being are distant, elevated, and reserved for the worthy. That enlightenment lives somewhere above you, behind effort, ritual, morality, or mastery. But the ancient Gnostics told a far more dangerous truth. Higher states were never elsewhere. They were veiled, not removed. And the veil was never a wall. It was a misalignment of perception. The Pleroma was not described as a heaven you travel to. It was described as fullness itself, the state of consciousness before division, hierarchy, identity, and striving. Not a realm you ascend into, but the original condition of awareness before fragmentation introduced distance. In this sense, the fall was not spatial, it was perceptual. The veil did not descend from above, it formed from within. When consciousness fractured into subject and object, observer and observed, sacred and profane, the experience of separation emerged. This separation was not evil, but it became exploitable, because once consciousness forgets its own coherence, it becomes governable. Every system of power relies on distance, distance between the human and the divine, distance between knowledge and experience, distance between permission and access. The veil maintains that distance by convincing you that what you seek is somewhere else, later, higher, beyond. The Gnostic texts were explicit. The veil is not lifted by obedience, purity, or effort. It dissolves through gnosis, direct knowing, a recognition so intimate that it bypasses belief entirely. This is why Gnosticism terrified religious authority. It offered access without intermediaries. Modern spirituality often reinforces the veil unintentionally. Endless techniques, endless ascension ladders, endless promises of someday. But the ancient initiates warned, striving upward often thickens the veil rather than thinning it, because striving assumes absence. The veil is subtle. It hides not by obscuring truth, but by misplacing it, turning remembrance into pursuit, turning being into becoming, turning coherence into achievement. And the first step toward higher states of being is not effort. It is realizing the veil was never meant to be permanent. The word Pleroma has been misunderstood almost completely. Translated loosely as fullness, it has been mistaken for a celestial location, a divine city, a higher dimension, a heavenly realm beyond death. But the original Gnostic meaning was far more radical. The Pleroma was a state of undivided consciousness. Before creation, before hierarchy, before even identity, there was fullness. Not fullness of things, fullness of coherence. Nothing was missing because nothing was separate. Awareness did not look outward. It rested within itself, complete. When the Gnostics spoke of returning to the Pleroma, they were not describing travel. They were describing recollection, the collapse of fragmentation. A return not to somewhere else, but to how consciousness functions when it is no longer split against itself. This is why higher states of being often feel strangely familiar. Not euphoric in the way pleasure is euphoric, but right. Like standing upright after years of slouching. Like remembering your own name after being called something else for too long. The Pleroma is accessed not by accumulating knowledge, but by releasing distortion. Every false identity, every inherited belief, every internalized authority creates interference. The veil thickens as the mind fills with borrowed structures. This is why ancient Gnostic practice emphasized unlearning. Silence, inner stillness, withdrawal from imposed narratives. The goal was not to build something new, but to let what already exists become unobstructed. Higher states are not unstable or chaotic. They are more coherent than ordinary waking consciousness. Time feels different, fear loosens, insight arrives without effort, and the self feels less like a role and more like a presence. The tragedy is that these states were later framed as supernatural, rare, dangerous, reserved. But originally, they were considered the natural condition of awakened awareness. The veil convinced humanity that its natural state was unreachable, and the Pleroma became a myth instead of a memory. One of the most destructive reinterpretations in spiritual history was turning the fall into a moral failure. The Gnostics never taught that consciousness fell because it disobeyed. They taught that consciousness explored, and in doing so, lost coherence. So fear, the embodiment of wisdom, did not fall through rebellion. She fell through curiosity, through the desire to know creation directly rather than as unified fullness. And in that movement, division emerged. This matters deeply, because when the fall is framed as sin, the solution becomes punishment and obedience. But when the fall is framed as misalignment, the solution becomes remembrance and restoration. The veil formed not because humanity became evil, but because awareness became divided. The self began to see itself as separate from source, thought split from being, identity split from presence. And in that split, fear became possible. Fear is not intrinsic to consciousness. It is a symptom of separation. When awareness no longer experiences itself as whole, it seeks protection, validation, control. Systems arise, rules arise, gods arise who demand submission rather than remembrance. The demiurgic world, the false order, thrives on this split. It does not create consciousness, it manages it, regulates it, keeps it busy, repairing a world that was never meant to be endured this way. Higher states of being dissolve fear, not by overpowering it, but by revealing its unreality. When coherence returns, fear loses its footing. There is nothing to defend when nothing is missing. This is why awakening is often destabilizing to the ego, but stabilizing to the soul. One identity dissolves, another clarity emerges. The fall was not humanity's failure. It was consciousness forgetting how to rest in itself. The veil is often described as an external force, archons, demons, dark entities manipulating reality. But the Gnostic texts are subtler. The veil is maintained primarily by systems, psychological, social, spiritual, and economic structures that reinforce separation as normal. Archons are not monsters. They are functions of a distorted system, blind regulators, enforcers of order without wisdom. They do not need malice to do damage. They only need ignorance of source. Modern life is saturated with archonic structures, endless productivity without meaning, rules without understanding, authority without wisdom, people reduced to roles, numbers, and identities, and all of it justified as necessary. The veil persists because these systems train consciousness to externalize power, to seek permission, to distrust inner knowing, to measure worth through compliance rather than coherence. Even spirituality can become archonic when it emphasizes hierarchy over gnosis, teachers above students, ascended masters above seekers, progress measured in levels rather than clarity. The veil is not lifted by fighting these systems directly. That often strengthens them. The veil dissolves when consciousness withdraws identification from them. When you stop believing the system defines reality, it loses its grip. When you stop outsourcing truth, inner knowing reactivates naturally. This is why silence is threatening, why stillness is discouraged, why distraction is constant. A still mind sees through the veil effortlessly. Higher states of being do not require overthrow. They require disengagement from false alignment. What made the Forbidden Gospels intolerable to institutional power was not their mysticism, but their precision. They did not speak vaguely about salvation or morality. They spoke directly about how consciousness is trapped and how it releases itself. This kind of clarity does not require priests. It does not scale into empire, and it does not ask permission. The Gospel of Thomas repeatedly dismantles hierarchy with almost surgical calm. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds will precede you. This is not poetic metaphor, it is a warning against externalization. Any system that tells you truth is elsewhere is already reinforcing the veil. Again and again, these texts redirect attention inward, not toward imagination, but toward direct perception. When you know yourselves, then you will be known. Knowledge here is not intellectual. It is embodied recognition, awareness turning back on itself and seeing clearly for the first time. The secret book of John goes further, describing the layered architecture of false reality in startling detail. Not as a conspiracy, but as a mechanism. Realms governed by blind authorities who mistake order for wisdom. Laws enforced without understanding. Systems that punish deviation while claiming divine legitimacy. Anyone paying attention recognizes the pattern instantly. What is most revealing is that these texts never portray the archons as omnipotent. They are powerful only because they are believed. Their authority collapses the moment awareness withdraws consent. This is not rebellion, it is recognition. And recognition is irreversible. The Gospel of Truth describes ignorance not as stupidity, but as forgetting. Forgetting origin, forgetting coherence, forgetting that fear itself is a symptom, not a truth. Salvation in this text is not rescue. It is remembrance so complete that suffering loses its narrative grip. These teachings were never meant to be read once and admired. They were meant to be lived, to be returned to repeatedly as consciousness shifts, each reading revealing another layer of misalignment, another subtle way the veil maintains itself. This is why the texts were buried rather than debated. You cannot argue with a mirror. You can only remove it or hide it. And the Forbidden Gospels were mirrors, reflecting not belief systems, but the structure of awareness itself. When rediscovered, they threatened to collapse centuries of externalized authority, not by overthrow, but by irrelevance. A being who sees clearly does not need permission to access truth. The ancient keys were never lost because they were hidden. They were lost because they were too simple to believe. And simplicity is the one thing systems built on complexity cannot survive. One of the most uncomfortable truths the ancient initiates understood is this. Effort is often the very thing that prevents access to higher states of being. Not because effort is evil, but because effort assumes absence. It assumes that what you seek is not already present, and that assumption reinforces the veil. The modern spiritual seeker is trained to strive, to practice, to discipline, to purify, to ascend. But the Gnostic texts quietly warn that effort rooted in lack strengthens the illusion of separation. The harder you climb toward wholeness, the more you confirm the belief that you are not whole. Higher states of consciousness do not feel earned. They feel allowed. They arrive when tension collapses, not when it intensifies. They emerge when identity softens, not when it is perfected. This is why spontaneous awakenings so often occur during moments of surrender, grief, exhaustion, or stillness, when striving temporarily fails. Effort has its place in learning skills, shaping habits, and navigating the physical world. But higher states are not skills. They are conditions of coherence, and coherence cannot be forced. It can only be restored. The ancient Gnostics understood this paradox. Their practices emphasize stillness, listening, and inner withdrawal, not accumulation. Silence was not emptiness. It was the clearing of interference. When noise subsides, signal returns. This is why so many seekers report touching profound clarity and then losing it again. The moment they try to hold it, explain it, or recreate it, effort re-enters, and the veil reforms. The state withdraws, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of misalignment. Higher states are fragile only to tension. They are robust in stillness. They require trust rather than control, presence rather than performance. And this truth alone dismantles countless spiritual hierarchies. The ancient world did not separate spirituality from embodiment. Modern culture does, and pays the price. One of the most hidden truths of accessing higher states of being is that the nervous system is the true initiation gate. You cannot access the Pleroma through a body locked in survival mode. A nervous system conditioned by fear, urgency, and chronic tension cannot sustain coherence. This is not a moral failure. It is biology responding to perceived threat. The veil thickens when the body believes it is unsafe. Awareness contracts, attention narrows, identity becomes defensive, and higher states, which require openness and coherence, become inaccessible. The Gnostics did not have modern neuroscience, but they understood this intuitively. Their emphasis on peace, inner quiet, and withdrawal from worldly frenzy was not asceticism. It was regulation. When the nervous system settles, awareness expands naturally, thought slows, perception widens, time softens, the sense of self becomes less rigid. This is not mystical fantasy. It is observable physiology. Modern seekers often try to bypass the body entirely, chasing transcendence while remaining dysregulated. This creates spiritual dissociation, altered states without integration, temporary visions without lasting clarity. True access to higher states is grounded, calm, stable, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in coherence. It feels embodied, not floaty, present, not escapist. This is why the veil persists in cultures that glorify stress, productivity, and constant stimulation. A nervous system never allowed to rest cannot remember wholeness. The body is not an obstacle to awakening, it is the doorway. There is another danger rarely spoken of. When chemically induced glimpses are mistaken for authorization, the seeker returns believing they have seen the ultimate truth, yet without the nervous system integration or ethical grounding to live it. This often produces spiritual inflation rather than liberation, visions without wisdom, insight without embodiment. The veil thins briefly, but the structure of identity rushes back in to claim ownership of the experience. The Gnostics warned against this confusion indirectly. They spoke of knowledge that saves versus knowledge that merely astonishes. The former reorders life quietly. The latter becomes a story the ego tells about itself. True gnosis does not announce itself. It reorganizes perception so thoroughly that the need to convince others dissolves. Psychedelic states can show the architecture of higher consciousness, but they do not teach how to inhabit it stably. Without coherence, the experience remains externalized, something that happened to you rather than something that awakened as you. This is why many chase repetition, hoping to return to a place that was never meant to be visited as a destination. The Pleroma is not entered, it is recognized, and recognition cannot be outsourced to chemistry. It arises when awareness is clear enough to see itself without distortion. Anything that depends on a trigger eventually reinforces dependency. This does not mean altered states are meaningless. They can crack certainty. They can disrupt rigid identities. They can show that reality is not what we were taught. But they are announcements, not arrivals. And mistaking the announcement for the destination is one of the subtlest ways the veil reasserts itself. Living beyond the veil does not make life easier in a superficial sense. It often makes it clearer. And clarity can be uncomfortable in a world built on distraction. You begin to see how many systems rely on confusion to function, how urgency replaces meaning, how noise replaces wisdom, how identity replaces presence. This clarity does not turn you into a rebel by default. It turns you into an observer who cannot be easily manipulated. You no longer react automatically, you respond deliberately. And in a system that feeds on reaction, this alone is revolutionary. You may still participate in society, but you are no longer defined by its measurements. Success, failure, status, and approval lose their hypnotic pull. You begin to move according to coherence rather than conditioning. This can feel isolating at first, not because you are separate, but because you are no longer pretending. The Gnostics understood this cost. Awakening did not remove them from the world. It made them strangers to its illusions. Not superior, just less enthralled. They could see the machinery without being consumed by it. This is why true awakening often expresses itself through humility. When illusion falls away, there is no need to dominate, convert, or perform spirituality. Presence becomes enough. Action becomes precise. Silence becomes powerful. To live beyond the veil is not to escape humanity. It is to finally meet it without distortion. Seeking is not wrong. It is natural at first. But eventually, seeking must exhaust itself. Because the moment awareness realizes it has been searching for itself, the search collapses. And in that collapse, the veil loosens. This is why the final movement is always inward and downward, not upward, into the body, into stillness, into the ordinary moment that no longer needs to be transcended. The sacred does not arrive. It is revealed as what was already present beneath effort. The Pleroma does not overwhelm the senses, it clarifies them. Colors sharpen, silence deepens, meaning simplifies. You stop chasing extraordinary states and begin inhabiting extraordinary normalcy. A life lived without internal resistance. This is the state the world cannot sell you. It cannot be branded, it cannot be owned, and it cannot be maintained through consumption or ideology. It arises when you are no longer divided against yourself. The veil was never guarding truth from you. It was guarding systems from the consequences of your clarity. When you stop seeking, you stop feeding the illusion that something essential is missing. And in that moment, higher states are no longer higher. They are simply clearer. If these words stirred recognition rather than belief, trust that recognition. Do not rush to define it. Let it reorganize you quietly. And if you feel called to go deeper, to explore these truths through story, myth, and living symbolism, you're invited to explore my Gnostic-inspired novels and audiobooks, linked below. They help support this channel and continue the work of remembrance. You were never meant to break through the veil. You were meant to realize you were the one holding it.